The Hudson Valley in the autumn of 1777 carried a tense stillness, the kind that pressed itself against the skin. The maples along the river blazed red and orange, their leaves drifting silently into the current. Distant thunder might have been storms rolling down from the Catskills, or the cannon fire echoing from Saratoga. For those who lived in the hamlets scattered along the valley, the distinction hardly mattered anymore. War had seeped into their very soil. Eleanor Whitford pulled her shawl tighter around her thin shoulders as she crouched by the riverbank. She had been sent to gather water for the evening stew, though truthfully she lingered longer than she needed. The river was one of the few places where her thoughts could stretch without someone reminding her she was too slight, too frail, or too timid to be of much use. She filled the wooden pail, watching the water slosh against its rim, and allowed herself a deep breath. The sun sagged low, spilling bronze light across the valley. Smoke from distant homesteads curled into the air, mingling with the pungent scent of damp leaves. For a moment, Eleanor could almost forget the war, the shortages, the endless talk of redcoats and rebels. But then she heard it, the heavy snap of a branch. Her head jerked toward the tree line. Something or someone was there. The next sound was unmistakable, a low groan, ragged and pained. Eleanor's heart raced. She wanted to flee back to the hamlet, to the safety of her mother's hearth. But curiosity and a strange stirring of duty anchored her feet. Slowly, clutching her pail like a shield, she edged toward the thicket. There he was. A man lay half-collapsed among the ferns, his blue coat shredded and stained dark with blood. His face was pale, lips cracked, eyes half-closed as if sleep battled with the pain consuming him. His right boot was gone, leaving a mud-smeared foot twisted unnaturally. Across his chest, the torn fabric revealed a glimpse of maps, folded and tied with leather cord, shoved hastily beneath his shirt as though they were treasures too important to abandon. Eleanor's breath caught. She knew at once he was not a common militiaman. His uniform, though ruined, bore epaulets frayed with gilt. His bearing, even broken on the ground, spoke of command. She remembered her father's quiet lessons, whispered before he passed. Those who wear such coats bear more than wounds, they bear the fate of battles. The man stirred, eyes flickering open. For a moment the forest fell away. His gaze, sharp even through the haze of pain, fixed on her. "Water," he rasped, the word more exhalation than speech. Eleanor hesitated. To help him was to risk everything. If he was a rebel officer, the British would brand her family traitors. If he was a British officer, the Patriots would condemn her as a collaborator. And yet he was dying. She lifted the pail with trembling hands and tipped its rim carefully to his lips. He drank greedily, coughing, then sagged back with a groan. "You mustn't stay here," Eleanor whispered, glancing over her shoulder. From the ridge above the river, she thought she heard a drumbeat, faint but steady. British patrols had been spotted within miles of the hamlet only yesterday. If they found him here, or worse, found her with him. His eyes fluttered, fighting for focus. "The orders," he muttered, clutching weakly at his chest where the leather cord hid the folded maps. "Must reach them." Eleanor's pulse hammered. She was no soldier, no courier. She was the sickly girl neighbors pitied for her pale complexion and narrow wrists. And yet, something about the man's desperation struck her like a blow. Without those orders, perhaps the rebellion faltered. Without him, perhaps the valley burned. Still, the voice of reason clawed inside her. "Leave him. Pretend you saw nothing. Go home and stir the stew." But when she looked at him again, his body trembling with fever, the faint shadow of dignity even in collapse, her feet betrayed her doubt. She bent, slid her shoulder beneath his arm and heaved. The effort nearly broke her. Her knees buckled and the pail of water tipped, spilling across the ferns. Yet somehow, inch by inch, she dragged him from the open ground toward the trees. The riverbank gave way to the narrow trail leading toward her family's cottage. The weight of him threatened to crush her. Every step was agony. Her lungs burned. But she thought of her father again, how he once said that true strength was not in the arm but in the will. One step, Eleanor. Then another. Branches snapped underfoot. From the road beyond the ridge, the drumbeat grew louder. Shouts followed, the clipped cadence of British voices. Panic surged in her chest. If they came down this path now, all would be lost. She half dragged, half carried him across the field, praying the gathering dusk would cloak them. At last, the small cottage appeared, its thatched roof hunched like an old friend against the darkening sky. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, her mother already tending the hearth. Eleanor froze. What would her mother say? A stranger, worse a soldier, brought bleeding into their home. Her mother, stern and cautious, who had already buried one husband to the violence of war. Yet there was no other choice. If Eleanor left him outside, the patrol would find him. And if they found him dead within their fields, suspicion would fall on them all the same. Her breath shallow, she pushed open the side door, guiding him through with painful effort. The soldier groaned but did not resist, his strength too far gone. Inside, the cottage was dim, lit by the crackle of the hearth. Herbs hung from the beams. The smell of sage and smoke filled the air. Her mother turned, startled, spoon in hand. Eleanor! What? Her eyes fell on the man. The spoon clattered into the pot. Sweet Lord above, she whispered, face paling. What have you done? Eleanor's throat tightened. I found him, by the river. He would have died. They'll be searching, mother. Please, please help me. For a long, dreadful moment, silence stretched. The only sound was the soldier's labored breath. Then her mother's jaw tightened. She shut the door with a decisive snap and crossed the room. Lay him here, she said, gesturing toward the narrow cot by the wall. And pray we have enough herbs left to keep fever from claiming him before the soldiers do. Together they eased him onto the cot. His head lolled, sweat slick on his brow. Eleanor's heart pounded as she wrung a cloth in cool water and pressed it against his skin. For the first time she saw his features clearly. The strong jaw now slack with exhaustion, the streak of gray at his temples, the deep lines etched by command and hardship. Not just a soldier. Something greater. Outside, the sound of marching boots rumbled past the cottage, the redcoats on their evening patrol. Eleanor held her breath, praying the thin walls would hide the labored gasps within. In that moment, with the drums fading into the distance and the weight of her choice pressing down, Eleanor knew life would never again be as simple as gathering water at dusk. She had carried a man across her threshold, and with him, the peril of war itself. And though she could not yet know it, she had also carried in the fate of a general, a man whose very survival might alter the revolution itself. The cottage smelled of damp linen and boiled roots. The fragrance of poverty stretched to its edges. Eleanor knelt by the cot, wringing another strip of cloth to press against the soldier's brow. His fever had climbed through the night, his breath shallow and uneven. Her mother had brewed a bitter tea from willow bark and yarrow, forcing a few swallows past his cracked lips, but whether it would lower the heat in his body remained uncertain. Eleanor's own arms trembled with exhaustion. She had not slept. Each creak of the floorboards or whistle of wind against the shutters had sent her heart racing, fearing the next sound might be boots at the door. But the patrols had passed, leaving only silence and the rasp of the stranger's breath. At dawn, light spilled weakly through the single window. Eleanor's mother, Ruth Whitford, stood by the hearth, slicing the last of the turnips into the stew pot. Her face, lined with hardship, carried little softness this morning. "You've done a dangerous thing, child," she said without looking up. "If the soldiers discover him here, it is not just your life they'll claim. They'll burn this cottage and hang us both as traitors." Eleanor swallowed. Her lips felt dry. "He would have died, mother. I could not leave him on the riverbank." Ruth set down the knife with a sharp clatter. "And if his death would have spared us all ruin?" She turned, eyes hard as flint. "Mercy is costly in times such as these." Eleanor's gaze fell to the man. His face twisted in fever. Costly or not, she could not regret what she had done. Something in his bearing, even broken as he was, had stirred a conviction inside her that surprised her. She was no heroine, no warrior. She was a frail maiden, as the neighbors often whispered. Yet she had borne his weight on her narrow shoulders and dragged him here, and now she would bear whatever consequences followed. The soldier stirred, muttering in delirium. His hand clawed weakly at the blanket as if reaching for a sword that was no longer there. Eleanor caught his wrist gently. "Hush," she murmured. "You are safe." His lips moved, a whisper barely audible. "Hold the line." Eleanor frowned. She glanced toward his chest, where the leather cord bound the folded maps beneath his shirt. She had not told her mother about those. Some instinct told her they were dangerous and precious both. By midday, the fever had broken slightly. He slept more peacefully, though sweat drenched the sheets. Eleanor rose stiffly to fetch fresh water from the well. The autumn air was sharp against her cheeks, and the village beyond their fields stirred with life. Smoke rose from chimneys, hens scratched in the dirt, and children's laughter drifted faintly from the lane. Yet beneath the ordinary bustle ran an undercurrent of fear. British patrols had increased, searching homes, barns, even cellars. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said spies walked among them, others that rebel messengers carried secrets through the valley. Everyone looked over their shoulder now. At the well, Eleanor nearly dropped her bucket when a familiar voice hailed her. "Miss Whitford." It was Mrs. Harper, the widow who lived nearest their cottage. She bustled across the yard with her stout frame and sharp eyes, always too quick to notice what others wished to keep hidden. "You look pale, child. Have you been up all night?" Eleanor forced a smile. "Only restless, Mrs. Harper. These are uneasy times." The woman leaned on the well, narrowing her eyes. "Aye, and worse may come. The redcoats searched my cousin's farm yesternight. Tore up his floorboards, they did. Looking for a rebel courier, they said." Eleanor's grip tightened on the rope. She prayed her cheeks did not betray her panic. "Did they find anyone?" "Not a soul. But they'll not stop. Mark me, they're hunting something or someone important." The words lingered like a chill as Eleanor returned with the bucket. She knew well enough who they were hunting. Back inside, she whispered the news to her mother, who only scowled deeper. "That proves what I feared," Ruth muttered. "This man carries more than wounds. He carries danger to every soul who shelters him." Eleanor changed the bandages on his chest wound, cleaning away the dried blood with careful hands. The injury was deep, a musket ball perhaps, though the bleeding had slowed. She prayed infection would not take hold. His face, though pale, seemed stronger now. She found herself studying the lines of his jaw, the faint streaks of gray at his temples, the calloused hand that even in sleep curled as though around an invisible sword. Late that afternoon, as the sun slanted gold through the window, he stirred again. This time his eyes opened fully, clearer, sharper. He blinked, confused, then focused on Eleanor. "Where am I?" His voice was hoarse but steadier. "In my home," she answered softly. "By the river. You were wounded. I brought you here." He struggled to rise, grimacing as pain seized his side. Eleanor pressed him back gently. "Please. You must rest." His gaze shifted to Ruth, who stood stiffly by the hearth, arms crossed. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you risk this?" Eleanor swallowed, unsure how to answer. Because she could not watch him die. Because something inside her had whispered that he mattered, that his survival meant more than hers. At last she said only, "Because it was right." He studied her a long moment, then gave a faint nod, as though accepting an unspoken truth. That night, the sound of hoofbeats rattled the lane. Eleanor's heart froze. She crept to the shutter and peered through the crack. Redcoats, a patrol of 5, torches in hand, their voices carrying in the night air. "Search the houses," one barked. "The officer is wounded and cannot have gone far." Eleanor's breath caught. They were coming closer. Her mother moved swiftly, pulling up the loose board beneath the cot. "Help me," she hissed. Together they slid the man onto the rough earth beneath, covering him with sacking and hay. He bit back a groan, his jaw clenched tight, understanding the peril. Moments later, fists hammered the door. Ruth opened with feigned calm, candlelight flickering across her stern features. "What is it you seek at this hour?" she demanded. "Orders of His Majesty," the sergeant replied, shoving past. His men spread through the cottage, overturning baskets, thrusting pikes into corners. Eleanor stood rigid by the hearth, her hands clenched so tightly her nails cut into her palms. One soldier yanked open the chest at the foot of the cot, scattering folded clothes. Another ripped herbs from the beams, sniffing suspiciously at their bitter scent. "Thin place," the sergeant muttered. "If he were here, we'd smell the blood." Eleanor's breath came shallow. Beneath the floorboards, she could almost feel the soldier's presence, hear the faint strain of his lungs. She prayed the boards held firm. At last, finding nothing, the sergeant spat into the fire. "Search further down the lane." When the door shut behind them, Eleanor collapsed onto the bench, her knees shaking. Ruth replaced the board quickly, then pulled the soldier out again, his body trembling from the effort of silence. "You see," Ruth hissed, "this is what comes of mercy. One day they will not leave so easily." Eleanor wiped the sweat from the man's brow. His eyes, though shadowed with pain, shone with a quiet resolve. "They will not stop," he said. "But neither can I. Those maps." His hand pressed weakly to his chest. "They must reach our lines. Without them our men may be ambushed. Entire regiments lost." Eleanor met his gaze, fear and awe warring within her. He was no ordinary soldier. This man bore the burden of hundreds, perhaps thousands. And by sheltering him, she bore a sliver of it too. That night, as the fire burned low and the wind whispered against the thatch, Eleanor sat awake beside him. Outside, the world hunted. Inside, she kept vigil, the frail maiden who had dared to hold a general's fate in her trembling hands. By morning the rain had come, a thin, steady fall that stitched the sky to the fields with gray thread. It tamped the dust, pooled in cart ruts, and softened every sound until even the crows seemed to speak in whispers. Eleanor woke on the stool beside the cot with a start, stiff from the night's vigil. The man's fever had drifted down a notch, leaving his skin damp and cool. He slept with his mouth slightly open, breath rasping but even. Ruth moved quietly at the hearth. She had filled a pot with water and onions and a precious bone she had saved for weeks. "You'll take this to Mrs. Harper by noon," she said without turning. "If the patrols stop you, say it's for the widow's sick niece." Eleanor blinked. "Why would I?" "To be seen," Ruth replied flat. "Women talk. Men listen to women who talk. They will carry your tidings on their own. If you stay locked in here too long, people begin to reckon what you're hiding." Eleanor understood. Secrecy was a kind of noise. It drew ears. A little ordinary bustle could muffle it. The wounded man stirred, eyes cracking open. Rain tapped the shutters. "Where?" he began, and then memory returned. His gaze found Eleanor's, steadier than last night. "You risked much, Mississippi." "My name is Eleanor Whitford," she said. "This is my mother, Ruth." He nodded once, pain tightening his jaw. He made as if to sit up. Eleanor put a hand to his shoulder and felt the rigid muscle there, the old strength intact under the wound. "Not yet. I must be moving," he murmured, a stubbornness showing through the haze. His fingers rose to his chest where the leather cord lay hidden beneath his shirt. "Those papers cannot sleep indoors any longer." Ruth bristled. "They sleep here until you can stand. I won't have you dying on my floor and making martyrs of us all." His eyes shifted to her. Something like respect flickered there. "As you say, ma'am." Before Eleanor could answer, hoofbeats thudded up the lane, closer, heavier than the night before. Voices carried through rain, clipped and purposeful. Ruth's face went white. "Under," she snapped, already tugging at the cot leg. Eleanor wedged her fingers under the loose board. The man gritted his teeth and rolled with them, every movement a knife. They eased him into the crawlspace amid the dry smell of old straw and dirt. Ruth scattered onion peels across the floorboards and sloshed a dipper of vinegar near the seams. "Breathe slow," she whispered down. "No sound." She replaced the board and shoved the cot back into place just as the knock came. No, not a knock. A fist that wanted to be a hammer. Ruth opened on the second blow. A sergeant ducked in, rain silvering his hat brim, a small knot of redcoats crowding behind him. With them came a man in homespun with a ragged beard, a local Eleanor knew. Eben Pike, who traded oats and rumors with equal zeal. Loyalist when it suited him. His eyes darted past Ruth, hungry for anything he could name. "By order of His Majesty's officers," the sergeant said. "There's a rebel officer wounded and at large. House to house. We'll need your floor up." Ruth's mouth worked once, then fixed into a line. "You tore up my brother's floor yesterday. You won't be ripping mine for sport." "Not for sport," the sergeant said evenly and gestured. Two soldiers shouldered through, dripping onto the packed dirt. One went to the hearth, another to the chest at the foot of the cot. Eleanor stepped away from the bed, palms open. The vinegar stung her nose. Beneath it, she smelled damp wool and rain and the faint living warmth that rose from the gap in the floor. She pressed her hands behind her back to keep them from shaking. Eben Pike peered at the cot. "You keep a man's garments, Ruth?" he asked, pointing at the peg where, carelessly, Eleanor had hung a stained blue coat to dry, the stranger's torn coat. "My husband's," Ruth said without missing a beat. "He wore blue in 60 under Amherst. He died for it. I wash what I please." Eben's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "There's fresh blood on that sleeve." "The bone for today's stew," Ruth said. "Perhaps you'd like to see it." The sergeant cut a look at Eben, annoyed. He tapped the cot with his boot. "What's under here?" "Bricks and mice," Ruth said. "Same as under your bed, if you own one." One of the soldiers dug a bayonet into the thatch of herbs above the hearth, scattering dried sage and mint. Another thumped the walls with the butt of his musket. The sergeant crouched and rapped the floorboards. The hollow sound made Eleanor's heart leap into her throat. She forced her eyes to the window, to the rain. "Don't look down. Don't look down." "We'll have this up," he said. Ruth spread her palms. "You'll lay them back yourself then, and cover the cracks with your own hands. And if my daughter takes fever from the damp, you can sit the night and rock her yourself as well." A small crackle passed through the room, laughter at the edge of it, swallowed before it could be born. The soldiers were men. They had mothers. The sergeant's jaw worked. "We'll be as swift as we can," he said finally, and reached for the board. Eleanor moved without thinking. She grasped the kettle handle and swung it from the hook as if to pour stew, then let it slip. The pot clanged against the hearthstone, sloshing a wave of boiling stock across the floor. It spread like a burn in the dirt and lapped the sergeant's boots. He swore and stumbled back, hot broth soaking his stockings. "God's teeth," he snapped. Eleanor flinched and dropped to her knees, dabbing at the mess with a rag. "Forgive me, sir," she said, breathless. "I've butterfingers when I'm frightened." Her hands shook for real now. The heat bit her skin. "Let me take up the board for you while you dry." She grabbed the loose plank's edge, tilted it an inch, then slammed it back down, making noise, making mess, buying seconds. "It sticks." The sergeant glared. Then very faintly he smiled. Not kind but human. "Stand aside." Rain battered the shutters. Over it came the bark of a dog. Then another, closer. The soldiers froze at the sound. "They've found sign by the river," a voice shouted from outside. "Tracks heading toward the mill." The sergeant straightened. Duty turned his eyes away from the floor. "Leave it," he said, and headed for the door, sloshing. "We'll return." Eben Pike lingered, gaze crawling over the room. His eyes rested on Eleanor, on her scald-reddened wrists, on the stew now steaming across the hard-packed earth. His hunger sharpened. You send your girl with soup to a widow? He asked almost gently. You're a saint, Ruth. Better a saint than a snake, Ruth said. His face twitched. Then he stepped out into the rain after the soldiers. Only when the last boot thumped off the stoop did Eleanor's breath go. She pressed her forearm over her mouth to keep from gasping. Ruth fell to her knees, fingers scrambling at the board. Together they lifted it. The smell that rose was earth and sweat and vinegar, and a human silence stretched thin. He lay very still, eyes open and bright. His jaw bore a new bruise where he had clenched it too hard. Eleanor reached for him, and he grasped her hand once, a firm squeeze. Gratitude contained because there was no room for more. They eased him back onto the cot. His breath hitched as the wound pulled. A dark bloom seeped through the fresh bandage. Eleanor's stomach dropped. She pressed a folded cloth against it, felt the hot pulse beneath her palm, held steady. Ruth poured cool water into a tin cup. The man drank, shudder-eyed. When he lowered it, he sat as straight as he could, the habit of command asserting itself even here. His voice when he spoke carried no fever's fog. We cannot wait for night, he said. The patrols have dogs now. The mill is north. There's a road hidden by the hedgerow. Ruth's mouth pulled down. You talk as if our lanes were maps on your table. They are, he said simply. His fingers went to the leather cord, tugged it free. From beneath his shirt he drew the folded packet Eleanor had only glimpsed, oilskin stained dark with old wax. He laid it on his knee and worked the seal with a thumbnail. Inside lay paper. Several sheets, edges rubbed thin, lines of neat script and rough pencil, river bends, notations about bridges and fords, lists of names. A small brass seal rolled onto the blanket, a device of crossed branches and a star. Ruth's eyes narrowed. Eleanor felt her breath snag. You're not a courier, Ruth said. And you're no mere officer. The man looked at Eleanor then, as if weighing what she had already risked against what he was about to ask. My name is Elias Morton, he said. Brigadier General under General Gates. These are dispositions for our left wing and orders to draw the militia through the timber and onto the heights. If they reach our men by tomorrow, we'll cut the king's army off the river road. If they do not, we may be flanked and bled by inches. The name meant little to Eleanor beyond the shape of it, but the certainty in his tone carried its own weight. Ruth's hand tightened around the cup. Men die over words written on paper, she said. And now you've placed those words in my house. I would not have if I had a choice, he said. No apology colored his voice, only fact. But I am here. And I must be gone before the dogs circle back. Eleanor looked at the rain-slick shutter. The lane beyond ran past their fence, past Mrs. Harper's garden, down to the bend where the willow tree leaned over the ditch. From there a hedgerow snaked behind the Harper's field to the old mill road that rose toward the ridge. In her childhood she had raced along that path, hiding in the hawthorn, popping up to startle hens. She knew where the briars thinned enough for a small body. She knew where a ditch crossed under the road in a culvert big enough to crawl through. She also knew her legs shook now, and that the British had put a price on the officer's capture. Eben Pike's eyes had been a ledger scanning the room, adding columns, subtracting fear. Ruth set the cup down. You cannot move him in daylight, she said. The patrols will ride that road until supper. They'll ride it more at night if they think they've missed something, General Morton said. He turned the maps and, with a blunt carpenter's pencil Ruth kept for lists, wrote a line across the margin. There is another way. If I can reach the creek near the birch stand, there's a cattle ford the army's maps don't list. I can cross there under the road and up the swale. He looked at Eleanor again. But I don't know this valley like you do. Her mouth went dry. She hadn't said a word, and somehow he had already asked. Not with command, but with expectation that felt heavier. The quiet certainty that she was capable. Ruth answered for her. She is not taking you through hedgerows like a smuggler in a chapbook. She's my daughter. Eleanor found her voice. You can barely stand, she said to the general. "How far is the ford?" "Half a mile," he said. "The worst of it is getting out of sight of the lane. Once we're in the ditch, the hedges hide us." Ruth stared at the floor, lips tight as if holding back a prayer. When she looked up, anger had burned away, leaving a hard, steady thing in its place. She crossed to the cupboard and removed a small jar of honey, a strip of linen, and a coil of twine. "I'll bind you tight," she told him. "You'll think yourself a barrel. And you'll keep your weight on my girl no more than you must." He took the binding without a word, jaw braced while Ruth wound linen around his ribs and knotted it firm. He swayed once, eyes shuttering with pain, then set his feet again. Eleanor moved to his side. Even leaning on her, he felt like a tree against a reed. She could feel the heat of him through the blanket, the iron under the hurt. Rain thickened. Ruth thrust a shawl at Eleanor and a battered hat at the general. "Keep your head down," she said. "If anyone asks, you're a cousin from Kinderhook with a cough." She dug into a tin and came up with a stub of sealing wax and a folded scrap of paper. "If you're stopped by patriots, give them this name: Lieutenant Abel Ross at the ferry. He once courted my sister and owes me 2 favors." General Morton's mouth flickered, a ghost of a smile. "This valley breeds formidable women." "Go," Ruth said, "before I come to my senses." They waited for a lull in the hoofbeats outside. Rain, a shout far off, then nothing but drops on the thatch. Ruth cracked the door. Eleanor slipped through, felt the rain cool her heated face, and turned her shoulder to take the general's weight. They made the gate without a cry going up. At Mrs. Harper's yard a dog lifted its head and huffed. Eleanor tossed a heel of stale bread and it fell to gnawing content. They slid along the hedgerow's shadow, the wet leaves pressing cold against Eleanor's skirts. Mud sucked at their shoes. The general grunted once when the ground tilted, and she felt it as vibration more than sound, so close they were. At the willow bend they crouched. The lane lay 10 paces away, empty, washed clean. Over it the hedges stitched together, thorn and leaf forming a green-black tunnel. Eleanor ducked and pulled the general after her into that narrow seam. For 100 steps they moved in a half-crouch, briars scratching, rain pattering, breath fogging the close air. Eleanor's thighs burned. Her back answered with a slow scream. The general spared a hand once to steady her over a root. His touch brief, careful. "Almost," he murmured. They reached the culvert, a stone throat under the road where the ditch dove and came up on the far side. Water hurried there in a brown ribbon. Eleanor slid in first, shoes soaking, skirt dragging. The space was shoulder-tight, the ceiling rough. On the road above, a wagon rattled past, wheels crunching. Mud dripped off the stone. She held still, feeling the sound in her teeth. When it faded, she crawled forward and out into the ditch beyond, sucking air like a swimmer. The general came after, slower, a groan locked behind his teeth. They crouched among the hawthorn. From here Eleanor could see the birch stand in the mist, white trunks like bones. "Another 100 yards," she said, and surprised herself by how calm it sounded. Behind them shouts rose, the search pivoting, men calling to dogs. A horn blew, thin in the rain. Eleanor felt the sound like a hand on her spine pushing them forward. They went. A rabbit burst from the brush and tore away. The ditch shallowed, the hedges pulled back. The land opened to the soggy edge of a pasture. Across it the creek ran dark and quick. Beyond that, the ground rose in a swale no cart used and no map needed. The ford was not a proper ford, merely a stretch where the stream spread itself thin over a gravel bed. The current tugged at Eleanor's ankles as she stepped in, cold biting up to her knees. She turned, braced, and held out both hands. General Morton looked at her for a heartbeat, rain coursing down his hat brim, and then he stepped into the water. For a terrible second his leg buckled and his weight crashed against her. She locked her arms, teeth bared, and took it. The water climbed to his thigh. Red swirled once from his bandage and washed away. He set his jaw and moved. 3 steps. The far bank rose underfoot. They scrambled onto it and collapsed into wet grass, chest to chest with the earth. Shouts again, closer then farther. The patrol had turned down the lane they had just tunneled beneath. A dog barked on the near bank and stopped, baffled by the water's clean slate. Rain wrote fresh lines over everything. They lay there until Eleanor could hear nothing but the creek and the blood in her ears. When she looked up, the swale rose ahead into gray and safety. The general pushed himself to his knees, face drawn, eyes bright. "Can you make the rest alone?" she asked, breath shredding her words. "I can loop back the longer way, be seen in the lane with Mrs. Harper's pot. They'll think I never left it." He studied her for a long, rain-polished moment. "What is asked of you," he said, voice quiet, "is more than a pot can hide." Eleanor swallowed. "I know." He reached into his shirt and pressed something into her hand, the small brass seal, cold and heavy. "If anyone loyal to our cause doubts your word," he said, "show them this. Tell Lieutenant Ross that General Morton owes the Whitford women his life and his orders. He'll understand." She closed her fingers around the seal. The metal dug into her palm and steadied her. "Go," she said, "before the dogs think to cross." He nodded once, a soldier's thanks, and started up the swale, bent and stubborn, every step an argument with pain. He moved like a man who had learned to keep moving. Halfway up he paused and looked back. Rain blurred his face, but Eleanor felt the weight of that glance settle on her shoulders in a way that did not crush. Fitted like a cloak. Then he was gone into the birches. Eleanor turned and slid back along the hedge, alone now, the brass seal hot in her fist though the rain made everything else cold. At the culvert she paused to listen. Voices drifted across the lane, laughter harsh as crows. She waited until a gap opened in their talk, then slipped through, skirt dragging, heart steady. By the time she reached the cottage, her hair clung to her cheeks and mud painted her hem. Ruth opened the door before she knocked, eyes raking her, in one piece, breathing, then flicked past her to the lane and back. "Well?" she asked. "He's on the rise," Eleanor said. She opened her hand to show the seal. "And he left this." Ruth looked at the little brass star and crossed branches. She closed Eleanor's fingers back over it, pressing until it bit. "Put it where no one will find it," she said. "Then fetch the pot to Mrs. Harper like we planned." Eleanor nodded. The search had swept past their door and would sweep back again. The day had hours in it yet, and each would have to be lived. But somewhere to the north a man climbed toward a swale the maps forgot, carrying orders that could tilt a battle, and he climbed because she had led him as far as she could. She felt thin and fierce at once, like a hawthorn in winter that still knew how to hold a nest. She hid the seal under the hearthstone. Then she lifted the pot, settled it onto her sore hip, and stepped into the rain with a smile ready for the widow and a lie polite enough to pass. The days after the search carried a strange silence, like the hush that falls after a storm but before anyone dares to believe the sky has cleared. The redcoat patrols grew less frequent, their dogs called elsewhere, perhaps toward Saratoga where rumor said the armies now clashed in earnest. Yet in the village, suspicion lingered in the air like wood smoke. Neighbors glanced at one another too long, doors closed a little quicker, and talk carried sharper edges. Eleanor went about her chores with the practiced rhythm of a girl trying to appear ordinary. She fetched water, mended linens, carried stew to Mrs. Harper. Her mother, Ruth, gave no outward sign of strain, though her jaw tightened when Eben Pike passed their lane, his eyes always ferreting. The cottage had survived the search, but the memory of booted men under their roof, bayonets prying into corners, had left its mark. The brass seal remained hidden beneath the hearthstone, though Eleanor often felt its weight as if it still pressed her palm. Some nights she woke certain she could hear it humming faintly in the dark, a reminder of the general's trust, of the narrow ditch and the rushing creek where she had borne him half her size. Then, one gray afternoon a week later, hoofbeats came again, not hurried, not hostile but steady. Eleanor's heart leapt. She stepped to the doorway and saw him. General Elias Morton rode a bay horse up their lane. His figure straighter, though still marked by the wound. His coat was clean now, his hair trimmed, his bearing that of a man who had stepped back into command. Behind him trotted 2 aides in plain homespun, their eyes watchful. When he reined in before the cottage, Eleanor felt every muscle in her body tighten with disbelief and awe. He dismounted slowly, wincing, and approached. Ruth stiffened at the hearth but did not forbid the door. Eleanor's fingers curled in her skirt. "Miss Whitford," he said, voice firm, carrying authority again. "I could not leave this valley without offering thanks." Eleanor flushed, unsure how to answer. "You should not be here," she managed. "If they see you, they see what I allow them," he said simply. "The tide has shifted. Our men have forced the king's army into retreat. The river is ours again for now." Ruth stepped forward, arms crossed. "And if it were not, you'd have endangered us twice over, bringing soldiers to our stoop?" The general bowed his head slightly. "Ma'am, I would not trespass your patience. But I come with more than thanks." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, sealed with wax. "The Congress has decreed commendations for civilians whose courage aided the cause. Few will know your names, but I will not forget them. Nor will Lieutenant Ross or any under his command." He held out the paper. Ruth did not move. Eleanor took it, fingers trembling. She read the scrawl. "To the Whitford family, whose aid preserved the safety of orders vital to victory." No name of hers, no recognition that history might ever recall, but it glowed in her hands like a torch nonetheless. Elias's eyes met hers. "The brass seal you hold is not token alone. If ever your safety is threatened by our own, show it. They will know you as friend to the cause." Eleanor swallowed. She thought of nights crouched over him, pressing cloth to his fever, listening to boots on the road, heart hammering. She thought of dragging him through rain and mud, of the way he had looked back at the birch stand before disappearing. And now he stood whole again, as if she had only dreamed it. Ruth's voice cut the silence. "Words and seals do not fill a pantry. They will not spare a widow's farm when the armies march again." Elias inclined his head. "You are right. Yet sometimes a name whispered at the right ear spares more than coin can. Keep the seal, ma'am. It may guard your hearth when coin cannot." Ruth said nothing more, but her eyes softened a degree. She turned back to the hearth, leaving them space. Eleanor stepped outside with him, the damp air cool against her skin. The aides busied themselves at the horses, giving distance. Elias faced the fields, the same ones where she had dragged him only days before. His profile against the sky seemed carved of something harder than flesh. "I owe you my life," he said quietly. "And more than mine. Without those orders, our men might have been broken at the river. You gave them the chance to stand." Eleanor shook her head. "I only did what anyone should. Few would have," he said. He turned then, his eyes searching hers. "They call you frail. Then the valley must rethink its measure of strength." Heat flamed in her cheeks. She glanced down, twisting the edge of her shawl. Words crowded but none seemed enough. At last she whispered, "What will you do now?" "What I have always done," he replied. "Ride where duty calls. But I will ride with memory of this place. And of you." A lump rose in her throat. She nodded, unable to speak. He bowed not grandly, but with the solemnity of a soldier honoring an equal. Then he mounted, every movement taut with healing pain, and wheeled his horse. The aides followed. They rode down the lane, the sound of hooves muffled by the wet earth, until the mist swallowed them whole. Eleanor stood long after, staring at the empty road. When she turned back inside, Ruth was watching her with an unreadable expression. "You've bound yourself to more than you know," Ruth said. Eleanor touched the paper still clutched in her hand, the seal hidden under the hearth, the memory burning like a coal in her chest. She knew her mother was right. Nothing would ever be simple again. That night the cottage felt both smaller and larger at once. Smaller because she knew the world beyond it now pressed close, its tides touching their very doorstep. Larger because she had glimpsed, for the first time, her own strength. Neighbors would go on calling her frail, too pale, too slight. Let them. She knew what her hands had done, what her will had carried. She had hidden a general beneath her floorboards, outstared soldiers, lied with steady eyes, and walked a wounded man through storm and fear until the valley opened before him. War would continue. The valley would not rest soon. Yet Eleanor felt a quiet resolve settle over her. Whatever else came, raids, shortages, suspicion, she would not meet it as the timid girl by the river. She would meet it as the woman who had chosen and acted and endured. When she lay down that night, the rain had eased. A moon broke through the clouds, pale and cold, lighting the fields. Somewhere to the north, cannon still spoke. But in her chest, the silence was different now. Not the silence of fear, but of strength waiting its turn.